Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take your sources, dig in, and pull out the key insights. And today, we're looking at something that, well, it really challenges how a lot of us might experience our spiritual lives. Have you ever left a sermon feeling like, I don't know, like you just sat through a lecture? Not really a conversation. In a world that's really clamoring for authentic connection, sometimes it feels like monologues drown out dialogue. And our sources today suggest maybe, just maybe, too many of us are stuck in a listen-only mode.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here, looking at sources like Design for Dialogue and Why We Lost It, is that they argue this pattern, this listen-only thing, it isn't just about style.
Okay.
They propose it's actually a fundamental misstep, a misunderstanding of how God actually disciples people.
Wow.
Their big idea, God's primary method has always been dialogue. And getting that, like really getting it, could unlock some truly transformative engagement.
So our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear then. Unpack that idea. Why is dialogue supposedly God's blueprint? How did we maybe lose it along the way? And most importantly, how can we reclaim this lost art of conversational discipleship for, deeper faith, richer community?
Exactly.
Okay, let's start with that bold opening claim our sources make. They kick off saying pretty bluntly that too often discipleship is just a one-way broadcast.
Right. Leaders speak, people soak it in, or try to.
And hope something sticks, yeah.
Right.
But they say this comes at a real cost.
It does. The sources really hammer this home. Clinging to these passive models, it results in disengaged congregations.
Okay.
Shallow faith. Leaders scratching their heads wondering why the impact seems so, meager. And they argue pretty strongly that in a culture that's pivoting hard toward personalization, participation.
Yeah. Yeah.
The church risks becoming irrelevant if believers aren't actually equipped to speak and listen with God, and just as importantly, with each other, in real time.
So it's not just a nice skill to have.
No, not at all. They frame it as a profound shift, something that challenges decades of passive listening that's really embedded in church culture.
So the core idea is that changing how we do sermons, small groups, mentoring, making it a two-way street, a dynamic exchange. That's not just for better engagement, it's a fundamental realignment, like back to a divine design.
Precisely.
That's a huge claim, though, God's primary method. What's the evidence? How do these sources back that up, especially when modern practice often looks so different?
Yeah, it's a fair question. And that's where the sources take us on this really fascinating journey, right back into the Bible. They connect it to the very nature of God. They start by showing how God himself is inherently conversational.
Okay.
Think about the Trinity Father, Son, Spirit, perfect union, eternal communication. They argue that when we disciple through dialogue, we're not just using a technique, we're actually aligning with that divine nature.
Huh. So it mirrors God's own being.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And think about Eden. After the fall, right?
Yeah.
What's the very first thing God does?
Right.
It's not a lecture, not a reprimand. It's a question. Adam, where are you?
Mm-hmm.
And the sources point out, God wasn't asking because he didn't know Adam's location.
Of course.
It was an invitation for Adam to sort of self-locate in his own brokenness, to reflect. That idea that divine dialogue often starts with a question for self-reflection, not just instruction. That's a pretty radical reframing, isn't it?
It really is. We were, as they say, designed for dialogue.
Literally.
So Eden lays the groundwork, but how consistent is this pattern in the Old Testament? Does it fade in and out? What does that tell us?
Well, it's remarkably consistent when you look for it. Think about Abraham. God doesn't just dictate, he invites negotiation.
Like with Sodom?
Exactly. Genesis 18, it's a back and forth.
Yeah.
Abraham's treated like a partner, not just a passive subject.
Okay.
Or Moses at the burning bush. God doesn't just give orders. He actually engages with Moses's fears, his objections, his insecurities.
Yeah, Moses pushes back quite a bit.
He does. And God listens, responds. Exodus even says God spoke to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Even Job, after all that silence, God responds, but not with easy answers. He responds with counter-questions.
Right, the whirlwind.
Yeah, drawing Job out of despair into awe. And the songs themselves, they're just raw, honest conversations, aren't they? Laments, praise, questions, all part of the dialogue.
Okay, so building on that foundation, Jesus, the ultimate discipler, how did he embody this? What were his specific conversational tactics according to the sources?
Well, Jesus, the word made flesh, right? He chose dialogue. It was his primary mode.
Yeah.
He didn't come down to deliver, divine TED Talks.
Right, good analogy.
Instead, you see him walking with his disciples.
Yeah.
asking questions constantly, listening to their fears, challenging their assumptions.
Like, who do you say I am?
Exactly. Or do you want to be healed? Or why are you so afraid? These weren't just rhetorical flourishes.
Yeah.
The sources called them doorways into transformation.
No.
They invited a real response. And his parables, too, they weren't just stories. They were conversational invitations. They made people wrestle with the meaning, engage with it.
And this didn't stop with Jesus. The sources say this conversational style flowed right into the early church. It became how the community operated.
Absolutely. It wasn't just a Jesus thing. The early church is described as a fellowship of shared life and shared words.
Okay.
Acts 2.42 mentions they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship. And that word fellowship, koinonia, in Greek, the sources stress it's way more than just coffee hour. It's deep mutual participation, shared life.
Right.
Think about the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. Big crisis, right? How do they handle it? It says they engaged in much discussion, and then they reached a discernment that seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. It was collaborative. Even Paul's letters, they aren't just one-way declarations. They're presented as part of an ongoing correspondence.
Answering questions.
Exactly. Addressing specific issues from the churches, always inviting response, further engagement.
It really does sound like dialogue isn't just, a helpful tool. It seems foundational to God's nature, his way of relating all through history.
That's the core argument.
But that brings us back to the big question. If it's so fundamental, so core, how did we lose it? How did we drift so far? The sources talk about this cultural drift, the rise of the monologue.
Yeah, it's the critical question, isn't it?
Yeah.
How does something so central become a lost art? The sources point to a few converging factors. A lot of Western discipleship, they explain, got heavily shaped by Enlightenment-era models of learning.
Okay, like the expert and the novice.
Yeah, exactly. The sage on the stage. Churches started adopting structures that looked more like classrooms. Leaders were trained primarily to lecture. Programs began prioritizing content delivery over relational connection.
And the result?
The result, they say, was discipleship that was information-rich but formation-poor.
Oof. Information-rich but formation-poor. That hits hard. I can imagine listeners really feeling that.
Yeah. It suggests we inadvertently built audiences, not really apprentices. We focused on discipling people's minds, teaching them what to believe.
And not how to engage.
Right. Not how to process, question, wrestle with things in God's presence. So many believers today, the result is they mainly know how to receive information and maybe repeat it. And there are other factors too, maybe a fear of discomfort. Dialogue can be messy, unpredictable. It requires vulnerability.
It's definitely easier to lecture than to really listen sometimes.
It is. And our culture prizes efficiency, speed, right? But real relational intimacy, spiritual conversation, that often requires a slower, more sacred pace.
So this model we drifted into, it has pretty serious consequences, according to the sources.
Oh, absolutely. They really lament this. They argue this model has alienated a generation that's, frankly, desperate to be heard, not just lectured at.
Yeah.
It leads to passive discipleship, relational disconnection. People feel less connected to each other and maybe even to God. It can diminish discernment, leads to spiritual apathy.
Wow.
And they issue a pretty stark warning. The church's credibility won't come from louder preaching, but from deeper presence, from genuine two-way engagement.
Okay, so that paints a pretty clear picture of the problem, the drift.
Right.
How do we fix it? How do we start reclaiming this forgotten blueprint? What does it actually look like to build a church that knows how to converse again?
Well, the good news is the sources don't just diagnose the problem. They offer concrete, practical pathways forward. It requires, they say, a radical reorientation toward relational truth-telling.
Okay, practical steps. I like that.
And they even give us a tool to help assess how we're doing, which I found fascinating. They call it the conversation tracker.
A conversation tracker. Okay, tell me more about that. Is it like a checklist?
Not exactly a cold checklist, more like a grace-informed tool.
Right.
It helps leaders gauge the vibrancy of the discipleship happening. Is it genuinely conversational? It focuses on assessing the quality of the dialogue across 3 key dimensions as you start putting these practices into place.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what are these practices? What are the kinds of things this tracker helps us measure?
Well, the first big reorientation, and maybe the hardest in our busy culture, is to actually slow down and listen.
Okay,
Right.
simple but not easy.
Right. It's countercultural. Discipleship just cannot be rushed. It means intentionally creating these sacred, unhurried spaces.
Like in small groups, one-on-ones.
Exactly. Maybe even prayer walks. places where questions are valued, maybe even more than quick answers, where people's stories are really honored as sacred ground. James 1:19, be quick to listen, slow to speak.
Hmm.
Imagine a leader just resisting that urge to jump in with advice and instead asking, tell me more about that feeling. That takes real discipline.
It really does. A huge shift from our usual pace. So we create the space, we slow down to listen. What's next?
The next step the sources highlight is asking spirit-led questions.
Spirit-led questions. What does that mean exactly?
Well, think about Jesus again. He didn't ask superficial stuff, right? He asked questions that went straight to the heart, exposed things.
Okay.
So it's about training leaders, and really all of us, to ask transformative questions.
Yeah.
Things like, where do you see God moving, even in this pain? Or
Yeah.
what fear might be hiding behind that frustration you're feeling?
Wow, those are deep questions.
They are. They guide the conversation beyond just swapping information and into potentially revelation. And this is one of the things the conversation tracker looks at, the frequency of these kinds of open-ended questions. Are we asking things that invite wonder, honest wrestling? Like, where does this scripture actually confront you?
So going deeper, not just looking for the right answer. Okay, what else?
Third, and this is crucial, value mutuality.
Mutuality.
Meaning conversational discipleship is relational, not hierarchical. It's shifting the frame from I teach, you learn to something more like we're seeking Christ together here.
Okay, less top-down.
Much less. And this applies to mentoring too. It shouldn't be just a one-way transfer of advice, but ideally a mutual transformation. Both people grow. And the tracker helps measure this too, the extent of mutual engagement. Are people really listening to each other, building on insights? Are voices shared, or is one person dominating?
That makes sense. Listening, asking good questions, mutuality. What's the fourth element?
The fourth one is maybe the most profound. Equip people to hear God themselves.
Okay, so not just hearing about God from others.
Exactly. The ultimate goal of all this dialogue is spiritual encounter. So we need to introduce practices that help people tune in directly. Things like Lectio Divina, that slow, sacred way of reading scripture, listening for just a word or phrase that shimmers, or prayerful journaling, or even just creating space for silence and solitude within our groups or services. These practices train people to listen with God, not just about God, kind of tuning into the divine frequency, you could say.
Tuning into the divine frequency. I like that. And how does this connect to the tracker?
This directly impacts the level of vulnerability shared, which is the third dimension the tracker assesses. When people feel safe and equipped to listen to God and share what they're genuinely experiencing, their real struggles, their real growth, you move beyond polite, surface-level chat. You get emotional honesty.
It really sounds like this conversation tracker could make these, often intangible spiritual shifts much more visible, more intentional. How does all this apply in bigger settings, like a Sunday sermon, or even just the average small group?
Great question. The sources definitely address that. For sermons, they suggest reimagining them not as the final word, but as starting points, conversation starters.
Okay, how?
Maybe you have some pre-sermon engagement, like sharing questions online beforehand. During the message itself, maybe building in short pauses with reflection prompts, like just pause for a moment. How would you have responded in that situation Jesus faced?
Oh, interesting. Interactive.
Yeah. And then crucially, post-sermon conversation starters. Maybe specific questions for discussion groups right after, or even just prompting a moment of silent personal dialogue with God before everyone leaves. They even suggest weaving more silence and personal storytelling into the service itself.
Breaking up the monologue.
Exactly. Creating more porous, interactive space.
And small groups. You mentioned the warning about them just becoming study halls.
Right. The tendency can be to focus solely on what does this passage mean, which often leads to hunting for the single correct interpretation, usually provided by the leader.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Instead, the sources encourage shifting the primary question to something like, what is God revealing to you personally through this passage right now?
Shifting the focus to personal encounter.
Precisely. They point to Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8. Philip doesn't just lecture him. He asks, do you understand what you were reading? That question opens a dialogue that leads to transformation. It's about reorienting study towards a shared encounter with God, embracing the messiness, the wrestling, allowing discomfort even to be a pathway to deeper faith and real connection.
Wow. What a deep dive this has been into design for dialogue and these related ideas. We've really explored how dialogue seems woven into God's original design for connecting with us.
From Eden, through the prophets, Jesus, the early church.
Yeah. And we've seen how maybe subtly cultural shifts pulled us away from that relational core, leading to a more passive faith experience for many.
Right. The information-rich, information-poor
Rich.
reality.
Exactly. But most powerfully, I think we've unpacked some really practical ways to reclaim this lost art.
Yeah, things people can actually try. Slowing down, asking those spirit-led questions, valuing mutuality, everyone has something to offer, equipping people to hear God for themselves.
And designing our spiritual environments or services, our groups intentionally for real conversation.
It really boils down to cultivating environments where every single voice matters, where we expect the Spirit to speak not just through the person up front, but maybe even more often through the person sitting right beside you.
So the invitation from these sources feels pretty clear. It's a call to step into this different paradigm, isn't it? To rediscover the power of dialogue as the actual heartbeat of discipleship.
Because we weren't just made to passively receive truth. We were made, it seems, to converse with the truth, with God Himself.
And that conversation, ideally, never ends.
It never ends. So the question for you listening might be, what would it mean for your faith or for your community if every conversation held the potential for an encounter with God's living word? How might you lean into the messiness, the questions, maybe even the sacred silence this week?